Welcome, Jessica Pang-Parks, Master of Environmental Studies, or Environmental Science.
Studies.
MES, Studies. Okay, all right.
Yeah. My undergrad is in the science. And
There, I knew there was
then,
environmental science in it somewhere. Welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me for priceless advice. It's so funny that I do not think that we have met in real life in the before times when that was possible. And that seems very odd to me because we know a lot of the same people, particularly in the Toronto area. And I used to visit it much more regularly for Better Impact hybrid conference. But our
right.
mutual friend who set up this Zoom date, Faiza Van Zant, has hosted this previous year with much success.
Yep.
And she also has been a superstar guest on Priceless Advice and offered some
Yeah.
tips. So, with so many people in common, and this being kind of a small sector, even globally, for people to know each other, I'm like, yay, I finally get to talk to Jessica. So, thank you for taking the time today.
Oh, well, thank you for reaching out. And yeah, it's always lovely to hear from you. And I've been, you know, seeing your work for years. So it's good to have this conversation.
Yay! Well, one of the things that we do have in common is we've been the past presidents of our professional association of North America. Between Jessica and Dana, we've covered the North American continent for volunteer engagement. And we also each share a background in, and this is such a random way to come into volunteer engagement, but we each really
Yes.
started with environmental conservation
Yes.
and then landed, into volunteer engagement and as leaders of volunteers. And your particular specialty, which we will get into more detail, but just kind of set it up for folks watching today, has a lot to do with not just how to be involved with your professional association, which is one of my favorite topics on this show ever, but how to work with and train paid staff members, paid team members to understand the volunteer activities, the programs, the rules, the regs, the good, the bad, the ugly, all those things. And that is such a popular topic year after year at conferences in person and online. I've seen uh, not just you, but like other people like hungering for that knowledge and consuming it at a wonderful rate. So, kind of beginning at the beginning, tell me about how your master's of environmental studies led you to today.
Oh man, I think everybody has the story of, well, I know a couple people who very purposefully chose this career path, but I think a lot of us just wind up here, right? And yeah, I moved to Toronto. I'm originally from Vancouver, so West Coast.
West
Yeah,
Coast. I got
West
family. I
Coast.
got family in BC and Vancouver and Victoria. So West Coast.
Nice. Well, you must be enjoying beautiful sunshine today. And are you in the Bay Area?
I'm in San Francisco, and it's
Okay.
foggy and overcast as per usual for this place. So you chose to leave the pretty good weather of Vancouver and West Coast, British Columbia, and go to winters of 40 below zero ish.
Right, you're talking Fahrenheit, yes.
Yeah,
So
sorry,
yeah.
Fahrenheit. So yeah, 10 below Celsius.
No, it gets down to like, yeah, below 10 below, 15 below. I
Yeah,
think the first winter I moved out here, I was wearing my parka in October
yeah.
and people were still wearing like windbreakers and I was like, it's freezing. It's only 3 degrees outside and 3 Celsius is
3
like
Celsius.
nothing,
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah.
so yeah, it took some time. But yeah, I will always have a little bit of Vancouver in my heart, but I think this is home now. And so I moved out here for grad school, and my focus was really on the teaching of environmental science in schools. That's what I studied in grad school. So it was all around student-centered learning, and it was all around how to engage people with environmental science, specifically the scientific part. Um, and then, I finished grad school, I had to look for a job.
Yeah, like you do.
And yeah, and the one I ended up getting was as a volunteer coordinator at the head office of WWF Canada. So it was a really amazing experience, amazing people, amazing organizations, still a strong supporter of them today. And my work there was to manage the volunteers at head office. So those volunteers did everything from mailing out hundreds and thousands of tax receipts to answering the 1-800 line when our staff receptionist was on her lunch, to making outbound calls to get people to update their credit card numbers, to supporting the fundraising initiatives, all the way from community fundraising to major gifts and legacy, and anything that we did at the head office, even some conservation stuff. We had a few volunteers once support our snow leopard researcher in looking through thousands of photos that were captured by a camera sensor trap, to identify which photos the snow leopards were actually showing up in.
Presumably from Nepal and not the Toronto Zoo.
Yes, in Nepal for sure.
One of those is harder for spotting than the other.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, it was a really amazing experience, and I think from there I just fell in love with the profession, and I continued along with it. And right now I am working in a membership role with a professional association outside of the volunteer engagement sector. COVID-19 has affected us all, and layoffs happened and all of that. But I would say that because I had gotten involved with my volunteer engagement professional association, I was able to gain a whole new set of skills and experience and market myself in a different way and increase my employability during this challenging time. So,
and you landed in, I mean, it's all related, and it's all of our skills are transferable, which is how we land from so many other careers into being a leader of volunteers. And you're with the Women's Enterprise Organization of Canada. Does that have a spiffy acronym, or do you just say the whole thing out loud?
We call ourselves WEOC. So
yay, WEOC.
yeah. And I mean, the mission really resonated with what I believe in. And it's all about building relationships. And I think when I finished grad school, I knew that I wanted to be working with people. Because when I entered grad school, I actually wanted to become an academic and researcher. That's why I went.
Never see people again.
I was actually very interested in studying algae.
Yay!
So I chose people not
algae doesn't talk back.
Yeah.
I think this is going to be hashtagged for the tags for YouTube, choosing people over algae, and we'll just see how many hits it gets just from that.
Yeah.
And even better, you're excited by that choice. You do not regret that choice, even in the times that we're in right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think working with people is my superpower, and maybe I've tried to resist it, or I don't know, like algae seemed pretty sexy at the time.
So you were with Tah-vah and currently with PAVRO, and
yes,
as is the norm in our sector, there has to be a V and an A in every professional something
yes.
about volunteers and something about association or administration. So Tah-vah, spell that out for us.
So Taaa-Vaa is the Toronto Association for Volunteer Administrators. So that was our local association. Well, it still is.
It didn't die out when you left it in the middle of last year.
No, they're okay, going
good.
Really strong. I'm super proud of them, and I'm still a member, and they're doing some really amazing programming during COVID times. So yeah, check out Taaa-Vaa. They're awesome. So I was there. I went to my first meeting. I had been a member when I was with WWF Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And then and then I wasn't a member for a little while. And then when I joined the Heart and Stroke Foundation, I rejoined, and at my first meeting, I raised my hand to become part of the executive.
Yay.
And I think about 2 months after that, I was the vice president, and we didn't have a president. So by like the fourth meeting that I had attended, I was leading the meetings. And yeah, and I think like that's the thing about our profession is we really, and I wrote about this in Erin Spink's book that she published last year on, I think, the top 20 ideas for,
Top
yeah.
20 trends for 2020 in volunteer engagement. I loved your chapter. I had a chapter. Faiza had a chapter. Andy had a chapter. Rob had a chapter. It was great to have such an easy access compilation in that ebook, and I'll put the link to it in the bottom.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
that's pretty
like
cool.
lots of really incredible ideas in there. And yeah, that's what I wrote about is we have to start practicing what we're preaching. We're working really hard in recruiting and stewarding volunteers in our professional lives, but when are we stepping up and volunteering for our organizations? And then at the same time, for the organizations, I think maybe there needs to be a bit of a different approach than the tried and true of these are the 5 roles on the executive. You either take one of the roles and volunteer, or you're not a volunteer, right? Like I've seen a lot of opportunities to split up roles or share roles, or to even have more informal roles. And those are the ideas that we have to be bringing from our professional lives into what we do in our associations. It's so important to be able to connect and learn and share from each other. And I'm really proud that I got to do that with Taaa-Vaa. So I served as vice president, and then as president, and then past president. And I continue to stay in touch with the exec. I mean, you also make friends, and it's, if you're joining a professional association to network, volunteering is the best way
Right.
to get to know other people and to learn new things from them. And yeah, and then I was asked by PAVRO, which is our provincial association
For Ontario.
for Ontario, to become their secretary. And I'm really enjoying the role. I've actually never taken formal minutes before. I'm learning a little bit more about Robert's rules. We're not super formal, but it's good to have a different role, and I really enjoy what we're doing. So yeah, and I see my colleagues across Canada in similar roles. Our national association, BMPC, is really amazing as well. So yeah, we're doing cool stuff up here in Canada. And we also have some, besides the professional associations, we also have some great volunteer centers. And one of the things that Taaa-Vaa has done is started to partner with the local volunteer center in Toronto. And I think sometimes that's a great idea, because after all, it is the same audience that you're looking at. And yeah, there's different functions, but there's a lot of opportunity to partner on things like conferences, especially when you're doing virtually. So
Yeah.
that's my 2 cents.
And I love it. And you just, you got thrown into the deep end of the pool, as they say, as the idiom goes, and swam and thrived and rose to the top. And my experience with, I did 6 years on the board of Alive, which is the full term. Not everyone, wants to or needs to, with life changes, do the full term, but I did 6 years, 2013 to 2019, the last year being as the president. And it was a very transformative time for Alive, with myself and Jason Frenzel and a lot of other new board members kind of came on in that season and turned stuff around. So it's absolutely team credit. And there's always the person who loves the wonkiness and loves the Robert's Rules of Orders and will call you out on a the versus an a in the minutes. And then there's people like me who know them because I've worked a lot in government agencies in the States and run board meetings and public meetings and facilitated those things, and know that, okay, it's the relationships that get stuff done. So I think it's a great experience no matter how, and they're both very valid approaches, no matter how you approach volunteering with being on a committee, doing a special project, having an executive role with your professional association, Dovia very locally like Taaa-Vaa, regionally like PAVRO, nationally VMPC, or something like IAVE, which goes global, that you're always going to learn something and new approaches from the people around you. So I'm hoping in your role as secretary, no one has been on your back about the A versus the V in the minutes.
No, I think we're quite casual unless the minutes need to be seen by an external party, like when we have to bring them to the bank and
Right.
the auditor and things like that. And we do have an amazing governance expert on our board as past president. Her name's Kathleen Douglas. And she had been president and past president years ago. And very graciously this year, she stepped back into the role as other members had to step off because of, COVID-19 related things.
Yep.
So
there's been a lot of shuffling. There was a lot of shuffling on. I still serve on the membership committee for Alive. I asked people, it's like, oh, I can I can still remain a member, but I can step away and, if everyone's sick of me, that's fine. Or I can, stay on the membership committee, which is one of the first places that I originally was chairing and joining and revitalizing. And fortunately, the new chairs are like, please stay on the committee. This is fun. Like, okay, this is fun. I like calling new members and, having little projects and coming up with ways to expand the brand and the awareness and get the members aware of their benefits. And I really enjoy stuff like that.
Yeah. And I think, it's a really low risk way for leaders of volunteers to try something new.
Totally.
Right? Because it's a volunteer role and these are our colleagues in the space. So we will give you grace. We will be there to support you if you need to make a change. And it's a great way to learn new skills, try new things. And I think it's a really great way to get involved. So
absolutely. And one of your specialties among your many skills is, again, that relationship building. And we had Andrea Hill from Memphis, Tennessee, who's an MPA and a CVA. So for the December Priceless Advice and Tuesday Tips, she really dug deep into friend raising and fundraising. And that's definitely something that you've touched upon. And before we completely dive into that, it's related, and your other specialty is getting staff on board, trained, on the same page, same wavelength, whatever you want to call it, with like what the heck is going on with volunteers in your agency. So tell us about your process with that, or some of your favorite ways to address that issue or train for it.
Yeah, for sure. I would say that let me kind of return to the part of, in your conversation with Andrea for a minute.
Yeah,
first.
fundraising.
Yeah. So what she described in terms of fundraising and fundraising was a lot of building partnerships with other agencies. And that was super cool because that is actually not the experience that I have. The experience that I have around fundraising and fundraising is around working with third-party fundraisers. Yeah. So people who want to organize a birthday party, and instead of having gifts, they would donate to your organization. Or people who want to organize a fun run, or I don't know, a games night, I guess would be the COVID friendly event.
Online bingo.
Exactly. to get their friends together and then also raise money for a specific cause. So that's the experience that I have with it. And that was one of the main programs that I worked on in my role at the Heart and Stroke Foundation.
Mm.
We did a lot of third-party fundraising in communities, and those third-party fundraisers are volunteers.
Right.
They may not see themselves as volunteers, but what are they donating? They're donating their time, their skills, and they're connecting with their networks for the mission.
That's volunteering in a nutshell. Time,
It
talent,
is.
donation of time plus talent equals volunteering. That's the equation.
Exactly. So it was really about working with the staff at our organization to show them how we could continue to steward those relationships. And I gave a presentation about this, and someone actually asked, well, how long do you want that relationship to last with your organization? I said, well, for a lifetime.
Yeah, in perpetuity, as the lawyers would say.
Yeah,
Forever.
like hopefully, you know, they get engaged and they do different things of their own. Maybe they don't have time to volunteer and they become a donor, or they, you know, retweet your organization's tweets. And then one day they leave a legacy in their will for the organization. Hopefully that is the relationship you build with them. And that's more my experience with fundraising and fundraising. And I think, you know, it's a really good way to engage people who might not be able to participate in programming that the
Right.
organization offers, because they might not just be a good fit for those volunteer roles, or they might not have the time, or, well, not a good fit,
Right.
or they really just want to do their own thing. And that's what third-party fundraising is about. It's about taking your passion and your time and being able to marry it to a cause you care about.
Yeah.
So,
And that
yeah.
ties in really well with one of Fiza's Tuesday tips and core ideas from her Priceless Advice video, which is meeting people where they are with what they're
Yeah.
ready to give, when they're ready to give it. And one of my favorite catchphrases is "Ain't no shame in that game." Like
Nope.
however we're engaging for 5 seconds for a quick yes, no, maybe so, or something like, you know, micro volunteering opportunity, or hey, I do want to have a funding relationship. Let's circle back in February. Whatever that is, whatever their timing is, just like, yep, let them have their rhythms and their timing and their life cycles of how they're meeting and resonating with the agency mission. And we can always, you know, as you know, tighten the message, or see how we can improve engagement. It's always a process, but really that's so important for people to remember, because I personally receive, because I have donated money to things over the years, especially environmental causes, and I am not going to respond to the guilting or shaming or fear-based end of the year fundraising. I'm not going to respond to it, even if I love the cause, because that's just like that's turning me off as a donor. And sometimes I'll actually send an email back saying, hey, I'm in this industry too, and this isn't working for me.
Yeah. 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 And it is a very tricky situation, because I think there's a lot of different approaches
Right.
to fundraising. And I think a lot of organizations are moving to that more long-term relational approach. But it's hard. Like, everybody's got their yearly
Yep.
targets to make,
Yep.
and it's hard. And I think that brings me to this part of, you know, the other thing that I'd like to talk about around
Sure.
how to train and coach non-volunteer manager colleagues to be
Mm-hmm.
great employee partners.
Yeah.
So the difference between a volunteer manager and an employee partner is that the employee partner is the one working directly with the volunteers, right? So they could be an administrator, they could be a fundraiser, they could be in communications, but they are not in that volunteer manager role of understanding the policies and procedures and the best practices and working through different strategies and coaching the team to do that work. I think there are some organizations that are structured where they have volunteer managers that are much more hands-on and they do all that training and the full package together. That was certainly how my role at WWF Canada worked. And there's different ways to do the same thing. But a lot of us end up in roles where we are there to be the resident expert.
Right.
And we're the go-to person, the subject matter expert for volunteer engagement. And that's great that the organization has bought into the importance of volunteers and recognizing that engaging them is something to focus on.
Right. Step one.
Step one, right? Step two is that part where you're the person who now has to connect your colleagues' KPIs to engaging with volunteers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think my biggest tips are find your champions. Who are your colleagues who get it, right? Right when you start and you begin those relationships, and even if you've been in the role for years, right? You know who those people are who get it, who do step up, who don't say things like, oh yeah, I'll use some volunteers to do that boring work that I don't want to do. Really awkward, right? Like there are people who are not going to say that, and they actually step in when their colleagues do, and they say, hey, actually, like, why don't we say it this way instead? So find your champions and share their stories and celebrate their successes. So one of the things that I did while I was at Heart and Stroke is I started a volunteer engagement bulletin. And it was an internal resource for my colleagues. And it was meant to be something that was fun to read. Like it wasn't onerous. It wasn't like a manual. It was more like a lunchtime, like, oh, cool. What's Dana doing in San Francisco, right? Like, exactly. And there'd be pictures and there'd be like an Ask Jessica column. And people started really responding to that because they were like, well, I want to be featured, because their boss would see who would get featured in this bulletin and be like, oh, hey, I saw that Jessica wrote about you and you're doing great work in this area of volunteer engagement. And then others would want to emulate that success. And in those stories, I tied volunteer engagement best practices to either increase in fundraising, increase in mission awareness, whatever that colleague's KPI was. And then the people in the same role would see like, oh, well, if they're doing that and that helps them be successful, then I should try to be like that too. So I really approached it from a see what your peers are doing and not, I am Jessica, I am the expert, listen to me.
Yeah. And people listen to things that are in their own language, in their own jargon. They will absorb things or learn things more that are aligned with their goals. So if the finance department doesn't understand the monetary value and they're used to thinking about things in Canadian or American dollars, and that's their world, that's their language, and it's so important. And I've just really admired that this has been your approach to things, and I'm glad we get to talk about it in detail, that it's so many kind of communication or relationship approaches and disciplines really melding together, and that's what Leaders of Volunteers, we're really good at all of these things, kind of combining these skill sets. And it's so true that people will hear something that they understand, and it takes us as Leaders of Volunteers with other staff to translate it to that department's common language, whether it's charts and graphs, or development department tends to be narratives and stories and emotional personal connection, like the classic marketing WIFM, what's in it for me.
Yes.
And when you hit that unconsciously, where it doesn't feel like weird and manipulated, but when it does feel like organic and we're chatting and it is genuinely sincere, that we need to learn to have these skills and make this effort to speak these other departmental languages, to break down these silos. So it's like, glad you're sharing your wisdom with people.
Yes. Well, hashtag choose people, not algae. So,
Hashtag people over algae. Hashtag.
yes.
And and so what were those? So in addition to the successes of people realizing, oh, this actually reflects on my professional development, on my
Mhm.
own career path, on my own standing, and how I'm valued and respected in the agency. Um, did the volunteers? Did you notice staff treating volunteers differently or better because of that starting to shift their realities a little bit?
I think yes. And I think part of it is just shifting the understanding of what volunteer engagement is.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes our colleagues in not for profit will come into their roles and they will see volunteer engagement specifically as recruitment.
Yeah, that's the blinders they have
that
on.
that
Right.
that's
Yeah.
what they see, right? And it's opening up their eyes to the entire cycle and really showing them that it's beyond recruitment. The most important thing is the stewardship and the relationship that you're building. And that goes from recruitment to training and orientation to recognition through the entire cycle. And that relationship is what benefits the organization as a whole and not just completing a specific task.
Right.
Right?
Punching hours in or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, I really think that that's the way it does improve mindset, but then also the experience of the volunteers. And it helps to reinforce organizational values, organizational standards. So those were a lot of things that I brought in
Mm-hmm.
to these communications, was to say like, yeah, well, when you do this, which is best practice, like Dana is doing in San Francisco, you are also reflecting on these three values that are really key to our organizational success. And this is how it fits in with our 5-year strategic plan. Plus, it helps you meet your KPIs
Right.
and demonstrate your value. So it's really tying all that information in. And I think if there was another tip I could give, it's around developing a relationship with the organizational leaders so that you understand what the goals and priorities that they have set for their team are. And some of those leaders, again, they will be your champions. They will be the ones saying to their team, like, hey, I really think we should get on this volunteer engagement thing. I want our team to be a role model for other teams. I actually did a presentation for one of the teams at Heart and Stroke, and their team leader said that in front of the entire team, and that made me feel really amazing.
Yay.
Right? And I could count on that person to be my champion
Mm-hmm.
for her peers at her level to really speak up and say, this is something that's important. It's worked for my team. Why don't you try it? Um, and and like it's really strategically connecting those most impactful things for every single person involved in the relationship. So it's the team leader, it's the frontline person working with volunteers, it's the volunteers themselves, and then how does that connect back to you as the person supporting and building the strategy and communicating best practice.
And
So
it's so good to build that advocacy and those champions and
yeah.
to amplify your message because I very often encounter doing workshops, doing webinars, doing one-on-one trainings, designing programs for agencies that whomever has been the volunteer coordinator, administrator, manager, director, when they're very often a department of one,
Mm-hmm.
they think and the agency thinks they're a department of one, and I'm like, no, actually, for one point, they have the most headcount of anyone. They're probably in charge of way more people than any other paid staff member, paid team member, and everyone gets to be deputized as a leader of volunteers. Everyone should have this kind of training. Did you have a schedule for this kind of in-service staff training, or did you do it as new people were hired, or what was your rhythm in getting the message out?
So the bulletin that I created, that was published regularly, and we
Okay.
changed the publication schedule because I actually ended up starting a second bulletin. So it became two different bulletins doing the same thing. One was for head office staff, so
Mm-hmm.
the people in finance and mission and HR, and then one was for our community fundraising teams. So again, different teams doing different things, right?
Mm-hmm.
One was very, very focused on building community, raising those funds, getting people out to events. And then one was focused on operations and all the things to keep a head office going. And that included major gifts as well, right?
Right. Right.
So it ended up getting split up. And then there were other things that I did. I started doing something called a Connect, Share, Innovate call with people who were working remotely,
Mm.
and engaging with volunteers in more rural communities. And this was done before COVID.
You were an
So,
innovator.
well,
Accidental innovation.
I think so. But yes, and we did it on the phone. This was before like
Mhm.
Zoom was super popular.
Doing things.
And it was another way for colleagues to connect with each other, learn stories, share successes, and also share challenges. And I think that's the thing about providing people with a safe space to share
Hmm.
challenges. And yes,
I'm so glad that we got to chat and collaborate and cooperate today. And we'll definitely have to, either in our continued COVID pandemic times or in a time when we're allowed to safely be together again in person, do a much deeper dive into algae and slime molds and environmentalism and working for environmental global or local organizations, and all the fun stories and anecdotes that we can't say publicly. Because there's always great stories behind that as well. So I really appreciate your time, Jessica Peng Parks, MES, for priceless advice, and we shall chat some more later on.
well, thank you, Dana. I had a great time. And yeah, I thank you so much for having me.
Yay! And scene.